Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 20, Chapter 1. The Rebellion of Vercingetorix. Gaul was now tranquillized, and Caesar, in accordance with his determination, started for Italy to hold the assizes. There he was informed of the murder of Clodius, and, learning that the Senate had decreed that all Italians eligible for service should be sworn in, he proceeded to levy troops throughout the whole province. The news of these events speedily made its way into Transalpine Gaul. The Gauls amplified and embellished the story as the facts seemed to warrant, spreading rumours that Caesar was detained by the disturbances in the capital, and that, whilst these fierce conflicts were raging, he could not rejoin his army. The opportunity stimulated the Gauls. They were already smarting under their subjection to the Roman people, and they now began, unreservedly and boldly, to form projects for war. The leading men of Gaul mutually arranged meetings in secluded woodland spots. They spoke bitterly of the death of Acco, telling their hearers that the same fate might befall them, and, deploring the fortune that oppressed the whole country, they made promises and offered rewards of every kind to induce volunteers to strike the first blow and risk their lives to restore the liberty of Gaul. The first step was to contrive a plan for cutting off Caesar from his army before their secret designs could get abroad. This could easily be done, for the legions would not venture to leave their quarters in the general's absence, and the general would not be able to get to the legions without an escort. Finally, it was better to die in battle than to fail in recovering their old military renown and the freedom which was their heritage from their forefathers. Chapter 2. At the close of the debate, the Carnutes declared that they would shrink from no peril for the common weal, and promised to strike the first blow, and as, in the circumstances, it was impossible to give mutual security by exchanging hostages, for fear the design should get abroad, they demanded that the confederates should make a sheaf of their military standards, an act which, according to Gallic custom, involves a most awful rite, and bind themselves by solemn oath as a pledge that, after they had begun the war, the others should not leave them in the lurch. The Carnutes were loudly cheered. All who were present took the oath, a date was fixed for the enterprise, and then the assembly dispersed. Chapter 3. When the appointed day came round, and the signal was given, the Carnutes, led by two desperadoes named Cotuatus and Conconetor Dumnus, swooped down upon Cenabrum, killed the Roman citizens who had settled in the place for trade, amongst others Gaius Fufius Caeta, a Roman knight of good position, whom Caesar had placed in charge of the commissariat, and plundered their stores. The news spread swiftly to all the tribes of Gaul, for whenever an event of signal importance occurs, the people make it known by loud cries over the countryside, and others in turn take up the cry and pass it on to their neighbours. So it happened on this occasion. The events which had occurred in Cenabrum at sunrise were heard of in the country of the Arverni before the close of the first watch, the distance being about 160 miles. Chapter 4. In this country dwelt Vercingetorix, son of Celtillus, a young Arvernian of commanding influence, whose father had held the foremost position in all Gaul, and had been put to death by his tribe for trying to make himself king. Following the lead of the conspirators, he called his retainers together and easily inflamed their passions. On learning his design, men flew to arms. Gobernitio, his father's brother, and the other chiefs, who thought that this was no occasion for tempting fortune, frowned upon his enterprise and expelled him from Gergovia. Still he did not abandon his purpose, but raised a posse of needy and desperate men in the rural districts. Master of this force, he won over every tribesman whom he approached, and urged them to take up arms in the cause of national freedom, and raising a numerous host, he drove his opponents, by whom he had himself just before been banished, to leave the country. His adherents saluted him as king. He sent out envoys in every direction, adjuring the confederates to remain true. He quickly secured the adhesion of the Senones, Parisii, Pictones, Cadurci, Turoni, Aulerci, Lemovices, Andi, and all the other maritime tribes, and the chief command was conferred upon him unanimously. Armed with this power, he ordered all these tribes to give hostages and bring him speedily a definite quota of troops. He fixed a date by which each tribe was to turn out a specified quantity of arms from its own workshops, and devoted special attention to his cavalry. With the utmost diligence he combined the utmost severity in the exercise of his command, coercing waverers by heavy penalties. Thus he punished serious misdemeanours by death at the stake with all kinds of tortures, whilst he sent home minor offenders with their ears lopped off, or one eye gouged out, that they might serve as a warning to the rest, and that the severity of their punishment might make others quail. Chapter 5. By these stern measures he speedily raised an army, and sent a Cadurcan named Lucterius, a man of the greatest daring, with a detachment into the country of the Ruteni, while he marched in person for the country of the Bituriges. On his approach the Bituriges sent envoys to the Aedui, whose overlordship they acknowledged, asking for aid to enable them to offer a better resistance to the enemy's force. The Aedui, acting on the advice of the generals whom Caesar had left with the army, sent a force of cavalry and infantry to their assistance. When they reached the Loire, the boundary between the Bituriges and the Aedui, they lingered there a few days, and then turned back without venturing to cross the river. They told the generals that they had returned from fear of treachery on the part of the Bituriges, as they had found out that it was their intention, if they crossed the river, to hem them in on one side, while the Arverni hemmed them in on the other. Whether they acted for the reason which they stated to the generals, or from motives of treachery, we have no certain knowledge, and therefore do not think it right to make any positive statement. On their departure, the Bituriges immediately joined the Arverni. Chapter 6. By the time that news of these events reached Caesar in Italy, he was aware that through the energy of Gnaeus Pompeius the situation in the capital had improved, and accordingly started for Transalpine Gaul. On his arrival he found it very difficult to devise a plan for getting to his army. He realised that if he summoned the legions to the province they would fight a battle on the march without his being present. If, on the other hand, he pushed on alone to join the army, he saw that he could not prudently trust his safety at such a crisis, even to the tribes which were apparently peaceable. Chapter 7. Meanwhile the Cadurcan, Lucterius, who had been sent into the country of the Ruteni, induced that tribe to join the Arverni. Advancing into the territories of the Nitioborges and Gabali, he took hostages from both, and, collecting a large force, attempted to make a raid into the province in the direction of Narbo. On receiving news of this, Caesar deemed it imperative, before doing anything else, to march for Narbo. Arriving there, he encouraged the faint-hearted, posted detachments amongst the provincial Ruteni, the Volcae Aracomici, the Tolosates, and in the districts around Narbo which were in proximity to the enemy, and ordered a part of the provincial troops and a fresh draft which he had brought from Italy to concentrate in the country of the Helvii, which is conterminous with that of the Arverni. Chapter 8. As a result of these measures, Lucterius was checked and in fact forced to retire, for he thought it hazardous to venture within the chain of posts, and accordingly Caesar started for the country of the Helvii. It was the most rigorous season of the year, and the Cevennes, which separate the Arverni from the Helvii, was covered by snow of extraordinary depth, which made marching difficult. But the snow, which was 6 feet deep, was shovelled aside, and, the roads being thus cleared by prodigious exertion on the part of the men, he made his way to the country of the Arverni. They were taken completely by surprise, for they had always supposed that the Cevennes protected them like a wall, and that time of year the tracks had never been practicable even for solitary travellers. Caesar ordered his cavalry to scour the country far and wide, and do their utmost to strike terror into the enemy. The news travelled swiftly by rumour and dispatches to Vercingetorix, and the Arverni in great alarm all thronged round him, and besought him to have some consideration for them, and not let them be pillaged by the enemy, for he must see that the whole brunt of the war had been shifted on to them. Yielding to their entreaties, he moved from the country of the Bituriges towards that of the Arverni. Chapter 9. Caesar had anticipated that this would happen with Vercingetorix. Therefore, after remaining a couple of days in the district, he left the army on the pretext of having to concentrate the new draft and the cavalry, and placed the younger Brutus in command of the troops, charging him to make the cavalry scour the country in all directions, far and wide, and announcing that he would do his best not to stay away from camp more than 3 days. Having settled these matters, he made his way, as fast as he could possibly travel, to Vienna, before his troops expected him, picked up his cavalry there, which he had sent on a considerable time before, in good condition, and pushed on through the country of the Aedui, marching night and day, so that in case they had any intention of molesting him, he might be too quick for them, till he reached the country of the Lingones, where 2 legions were wintering. On his arrival he sent word to the remaining legions, and concentrated them all before news of his arrival could reach the Arverni. Vercingetorix, on hearing what he had done, led his army back into the country of the Bituriges, and moving thence, proceeded to besiege Gorgobina, a stronghold of the Boii, whom Caesar had established there after their defeat in the battle with the Helvetii, and had placed in dependence on the Aedui. Chapter 10. Caesar was greatly embarrassed by this move. If he kept his legions concentrated for the rest of the winter, and the tributaries of the Aedui were overpowered, the whole of Gaul, seeing that he could not be relied upon to protect his friends, might simultaneously fall away. If, on the other hand, he prematurely withdrew the army from its quarters, he might be pressed for supplies owing to the difficulties of transport. Still, it seemed better to face every difficulty than to alienate all who were on his side by submitting to an indignity like this. Accordingly, he charged the Aedui to forward supplies, and sent on messengers to let the Boii know that he was coming, and to urge them to remain faithful, and sustain the enemy's attack with fortitude. Then, leaving 2 legions and the heavy baggage of the whole army at Agedincum, he set out to join the Boii. Chapter 11. Next day he reached the Velonodunum, a stronghold of the Senones. In order to avoid leaving an enemy in his rear and so expedite supply, he proceeded to besiege the town, and in a couple of days surrounded it with a contravallation. On the 3rd day envoys were sent out to propose surrender. Caesar ordered the garrison to pile arms, bring out their horses, and give 600 hostages. He left Gaius Trebonius to give effect to these orders, and being anxious to finish his march as soon as possible, pushed on for Cenabum in the country of the Carnutes. Believing that the siege of Velonodunum, news of which had only just reached them, would be protracted, they were beginning to collect troops to send to the protection of Cenabum. Caesar reached the town in a couple of days. He encamped before it, but as it was late in the day and he was prevented from beginning the siege, he postponed it till the morrow, ordering the troops to make all needful preparations, and, as there was a bridge over the Loire in contact with the town, and he feared that the garrison might escape in the night, he directed 2 legions to remain under arms. Shortly before midnight the townspeople moved silently out of Cenabum and began to cross the river. The movement was reported to Caesar by his patrols, whereupon he fired the gates, sent in the legions which he had ordered to remain in readiness, and took possession of the town. Very few of the enemy escaped capture, for the narrowness of the bridge and streets prevented the throng from getting away. Caesar plundered and burned the town, gave the booty to the soldiers, threw his army across the Loire, and made his way into the country of the Bituriges. 12. When Vercingetorix learned that Caesar was approaching, he abandoned the siege and marched to encounter him. Caesar had prepared to besiege a stronghold of the Bituriges, called Noviodunum, situated upon his line of march. Envoys came from the town to beg him to pardon them and to spare their lives, and, in order to finish the campaign as rapidly as he had begun it, he ordered the garrison to pile their arms, bring out their horses, and give hostages. Some of the hostages had been delivered up, and the other arrangements were in progress, the centurions and a few soldiers having been sent into the town to collect the arms and cattle, when the enemy's cavalry, which had gone on in advance of Vercingetorix's column, were seen in the distance. The moment the townspeople caught sight of them, they realized that there was a chance of relief, and with a yell they seized their arms, shut the gates, and manned the walls. The centurions in the town, understanding from the behaviour of the Gauls that they meant mischief, drew their swords, took possession of the gates, and withdrew all their men in safety. Chapter 13. Caesar ordered his cavalry out of camp, and forced on an engagement. Presently, his men being in difficulties, he sent about 400 German horse, whom he had regularly entertained from the first, to the rescue. The Gauls, unable to sustain their charge, were put to flight, and fell back with heavy loss upon the main body. On their defeat the townsmen again took alarm, and seizing the individuals, whom they believed to have been instrumental in stirring up the rabble, took them to Caesar and surrendered. This affair disposed of, Caesar marched for Avaricum, the largest and strongest town in the country of the Bituriges, which is situated in a very fertile tract, for he was confident that by recovery of this stronghold he would re-establish his authority over the tribe. End of chapter 13. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translation by Thomas Rice Holmes. Chapter 14. Having sustained these successive disasters at Vallonodunum, Cenabum, and Noviodunum, Vercingetorix called his followers to a council. He told them that the campaign must thenceforward be conducted on widely different lines. The object was by every means to prevent the Romans from foraging and getting supplies. This object could easily be attained, for their side was strong in cavalry, and the season was in their favour. No grass could be cut. The enemy must perforce disperse and get fodder from the barns, and the cavalry could destroy all these detachments from day to day. Moreover, in the public interest, personal convenience must be disregarded. All round the road, as far as the country was accessible for forage, the hamlets and homesteads should be burned. They were well off for supplies themselves, as they could draw upon the resources of the people whose territory was the theatre of the war, but the Romans would either succumb to their privations, or would have to move far from their camp, at great risk, and it made no difference whether they killed them, or took their baggage, for, if it were lost, they could not keep the field. Moreover, it would be well to burn those towns which were not rendered impregnable by fortification and a naturally strong position, for fear they should serve their own side as refuges for shirking military duty, and tempt the Romans to pillage them and plunder their stores. If this sounded hard or cruel, they should consider how much harder it was for their wives and children to be carried off into slavery while they were themselves put to death, and if they were beaten, this would be inevitable. Chapter 15. This view was unanimously approved, and in a single day more than 20 towns belonging to the Bituriges were set ablaze. The same thing happened in the territories of the other tribes. The whole country was a scene of conflagration, and although all felt this a grievous trial, they consoled themselves with the assurance that victory was practically in their grasp, and that they would soon recover what they had lost. The question was debated in a general assembly, whether Avaricum should be burned or defended. The Bituriges knelt before their countrymen, begging that they might not be forced to fire with their own hands the town which was well nigh the finest in the whole of Gaul, the bulwark and the pride of their people. It was naturally so strong that they would easily defend it, for it was almost entirely surrounded by running water and marshy ground, and could only be approached at one place, which was very narrow. Their prayer was granted. Vercingetorix at first opposed them, but afterwards gave way, in deference to their entreaties and the general sympathy that was shown them. Capable officers were selected to defend the town. Chapter 16. Vercingetorix, following Caesar by easy stages, selected for his encampment a spot protected by marshes and woods 16 miles from Avaricum. He hourly kept himself informed, by organised patrols, of what was going on at Avaricum, and issued his orders accordingly. He watched all our expeditions for forage and corn, attacked our men when they were scattered, for they were obliged to go far afield, and inflicted on them considerable loss, although they took every precaution that ingenuity could devise to baffle him, starting at odd times and in different directions. Chapter 17. Caesar encamped on the side of the town which, as we have mentioned above, was undefended by running water and marshy ground, and was approached by a narrow neck of land. As the lie of the country made it impossible to invest the position, he proceeded to build a terrace, form lines of sheds, and erect 2 towers. He urged the Boii and the Aedui unceasingly to keep him supplied with grain, but the latter, being half-hearted, were of little service, while the former, a small and feeble tribe, whose resources were slender, soon used up what they had. Owing to the poverty of the Boii, and the slackness of the Aedui, and the burning of the granaries, the army was in the greatest straits for supplies, insomuch that for several days the men were without grain, and only kept famine at bay by driving in the cattle from distant villages. Yet not a word were they heard to utter unworthy of the majesty of the Roman people, and their own record of victory. Nor was this all. Caesar spoke to the legions singly while they were at work, and told them that, if they found their privations too hard to bear, he would abandon the siege. But with one voice they begged him not to do so. They had served under his command for several years without disgrace, and had never abandoned any operation which they had undertaken. They would feel it a disgrace to abandon the siege, having once begun it, and it was better to put up with every hardship than fail in avenging the Romans who had fallen at Cenabum by Gallic treachery. They said the same to the centurions and tribunes, charging them to repeat it to Caesar. Chapter 18. The towers were now getting close to the wall. Caesar learned from prisoners that Vercingetorix, having consumed his provender, had moved closer to Avaricum, and gone off himself with his cavalry and the light-armed foot who regularly fight along with the cavalry, intending to lie in ambush at the spot where he believed that our men would go to forage on the following day. Acting on this information, Caesar started quietly at midnight, and reached the enemy's encampment in the morning. They were informed of his approach by their patrols, and, swiftly removing their carts and baggage into the densest part of the woods, drew up all their forces on open rising ground. On receiving this report, Caesar ordered the troops to pile their packs promptly and get their arms ready. Chapter 19. The hill sloped gently upward from its base, and was almost entirely surrounded by holding, marshy ground, difficult to cross, but not more than 50 feet wide. The Gauls had broken down the causeways and remained obstinately on the hill, confident in the strength of the position. Formed up in tribal groups, they held all the fords and the thickets that bordered the marsh, determined, if the Romans attempted to force a passage, to attack them from their commanding position while they were bogged in the slush. Seeing the proximity of the two forces, one would have thought that the Gauls were ready to fight and that the chances were nearly even. But anyone who detected the disparity in the conditions would have known that their defiant attitude was mere bravado. The legionaries, indignant that the enemy behind that paltry barrier had the hardihood to look them in the face, clamoured for the signal for action. But Caesar made them understand that victory could only be gained at a heavy cost, and by the sacrifice of many brave men. He could see that for his honour their hearts were steeled to face any peril, and for that reason he should deserve to be called the most heartless of men if he did not hold their lives dearer than his own reputation. In this way he soothed the men's feelings, and, leading them back the same day to camp, proceeded to complete his arrangements for the siege of the town. Chapter 20. Vercingetorix, on returning to his troops, was accused of treachery. The charge was that he had moved nearer the Romans, that he had taken all the cavalry with him, that he had left his numerous forces without a head, and that on his departure the Romans had rapidly advanced at the opportune moment. These things could not have happened by accident, they must have been deliberately planned, and evidently he would rather reign over Gaul as Caesar's creature than by the favour of his countrymen. In reply to these charges, Vercingetorix said that if he had shifted his camp, he had done so because forage was scarce, and at their own instigation. If he had moved nearer to the Romans, it was because he was attracted by a favourable position, whose natural features were its own defence, while cavalry ought not to have been required on marshy ground, and were useful in the place to which they had actually gone.
When he left them, he had deliberately refrained from delegating the command to any one, for fear his substitute might be driven by the impetuosity of the host to flight. For he could see that that was what they all wanted, because they were infirm of purpose and incapable of prolonged exertion. If the arrival of the Romans in his absence was accidental, they ought to thank fortune. If they had come on the invitation of a spy, they ought to thank him for having enabled them to ascertain from their commanding position the smallness of their numbers, and to see how despicable was the spirit of men who dared not fight, but slunk back ignominiously to their camp. For himself, he did not want to get from Caesar by treachery a power which he could secure by victory which was already in his grasp and in that of the whole Gallic people. No, he would give them back their gift if they imagined that they were conferring a favour upon him, instead of owing their safety to him. To satisfy yourselves, he continued, that what I say is true, listen to Roman soldiers. He made some slaves step forward, whom he had captured foraging a few days before, and had kept in chains on starvation diet. They had been carefully taught beforehand what to say when questioned. They said that they were legionaries. Hunger and want had led them to steal out of camp to see whether they could find any corn or cattle in the fields. The whole army was in the same straits, and not a man was now strong enough to stand the strain of his daily work. The general had therefore resolved to withdraw the army in 3 days, unless he made some real progress in the siege of the town. These benefits, said Vercingetorix, you owe to me whom you falsely accuse of treachery. Thanks to my efforts, without shedding a drop of your blood, you see this mighty, this victorious army well nigh starved, and I have taken care of that, when it seeks safety in ignominious flight, not one tribe shall grant it refuge. Chapter 21. The whole multitude cheered loudly and clashed their weapons in the native fashion, for Gauls generally do this when they are pleased with what an orator says. Vercingetorix, they declared, was the greatest of leaders, his loyalty was above suspicion, and it was impossible to carry on the war with greater judgment. They determined to throw 10,000 men, selected from all the contingents, into the town, not thinking it wise to trust the national safety to the Bituriges alone, for they realized that if the Bituriges succeeded in holding the town, the whole victory would be theirs. Chapter 22. The extraordinary valour of our soldiers found its match in the manifold devices of the Gauls, for they are a most ingenious people, and always show the greatest aptitude in borrowing and giving effect to ideas which they get from any one. They pulled aside the grappling hooks with nooses, and when they had got hold of them, hauled them inside the town by means of windlasses. They also undermined and dragged away the material of the terrace, performing the operation very adroitly, because there are large iron mines in their country, and they are thoroughly familiar with every kind of underground gallery. Moreover, they had covered the whole wall at every point with towers, provided with platforms and protected by hides. Again, they made frequent sorties by day and night, setting fire to the terrace or attacking the troops at their work. As the terrace, daily rising, raised our towers to a higher level, they lashed together the uprights of their own towers, and gave them a corresponding elevation, and opening into the Roman mines, they prevented them, with beams sharpened and hardened in the fire, boiling pitch, and heavy stones, from approaching the wall. Chapter 23. Gallic walls are always constructed on the following or some similar plan. Balks of timber are laid upon the ground at right angles to the line of the intended wall, and in unbroken succession along its length, at regular intervals of 2 feet. These balks are made fast on the inner side, and thickly coated with rubble, while the intervals above mentioned are tightly packed in front with large stones. When the balks are fixed in their places and fastened together, a fresh row is laid on the top of them in such a way that the same interval is kept, and the balks do not touch each other, but are separated by similar intervals, into each of which a stone is thrust, and thus are kept firmly in position. Thus, step by step, the whole fabric is constructed until the wall reaches its proper height. While the structure, with its alternate balks and stones, which preserve their regular succession in straight lines, presents a variegated aspect which is not unsightly, it is also extremely serviceable and adapted for the defence of towns, for the stone secures it against fire, and the woodwork, which is braced on the inner side, by beams generally 40 feet long running right across, and so can neither be broken through nor pulled to pieces, protects it against the ram. Chapter 24. All the above-mentioned causes impeded the siege, and the men were hampered all the time by cold and continual rain. Yet by unremitting toil they overcame all these difficulties, and in 25 days erected a terrace 330 feet broad and 80 feet high. The terrace was almost in contact with the enemy's wall, and Caesar was, as usual, bivouacking at the works, urging the men not to suspend labour for a moment, when, a little before the third watch, it was noticed that the terrace was smoking. The enemy had undermined and set it on fire. At the same moment a cheer arose all along the wall, and troops came pouring out of the 2 gates on either side of the towers, while others flung down torches and dry wood from their commanding position on the wall onto the terrace, and shot pitch and other inflammable material, so that it was scarcely possible to decide where to strike a counter-blow or what point to reinforce. But Caesar's practice was to have 2 legions regularly bivouacking in front of the camp, while a larger number, which took duty in turns, were constantly at work, so that a number of men soon checked the sortie, while others drew back the towers and dragged asunder the timbers of the terrace, and the whole multitude from the camp came thronging to extinguish the flames. Chapter 25. The rest of the night passed by, and still the fight was going on at every point. The enemy's hope of victory continually revived, for they saw that the breastworks of the towers were burnt, and that it was not easy to advance and support a threatened position without cover. In their own ranks fresh men were continually relieving those who were tired, and they felt that on that moment depended the salvation of Gaul. Just then we witnessed an episode which seemed worthy of remembrance, and we have therefore thought ought not to be passed over. A Gaul, standing in front of one of the gates of the town, was throwing lumps of fat and pitch, passed to him from hand to hand, into the fire opposite one of the towers. A bolt from a small catapult pierced him on the right side, and he dropped dead. One of the men nearest him stepped across his prostrate body and continued the work. A shot from the catapult killed him in the same way, and a third man took his place, and a fourth the place of the third. Nor was the post abandoned by the defenders until the fire on the terrace was put out, the enemy everywhere repulsed, and the fighting at an end. Chapter 26. The Gauls had tried every expedient, and next day, as nothing had succeeded, they took the urgent advice of Vercingetorix and determined to escape from the town. By making the attempt in the stillness of night they hoped to succeed without much loss, for Vercingetorix's camp was not far from the town, and the continuous marsh which intervened would make it difficult for the Romans to pursue. It was night, and they were preparing for their attempt, when suddenly the matrons came running into the open and, weeping and flinging themselves at their husbands' feet, passionately entreated them not to give them up, and the children who were their common possession, to the tender mercies of the enemy, for natural bodily weakness prevented them from making their escape. When they saw that their resolve was immovable, for often in extremity of peril fear leaves no room for compassion, they began to scream and gesticulate, to warn the Romans of the intended flight. The Gauls were terrified by this, fearing that the Roman cavalry would seize the roads, and abandoned their resolve. Chapter 27. Next day Caesar advanced one of his towers, and the works which he had begun were completed. A heavy storm of rain came on, and he thought the opportunity a good one for maturing his plans. Observing that the guards were rather carelessly posted on the wall, he ordered his own men to go about their work with a show of listlessness, and explained his intention. The legions, unobserved, got ready for action under the cover of the sheds. Caesar told them that now was the moment to repay themselves for their Herculean toils and grasp the prize of victory, and offering rewards to the men who should first mount the wall, he gave the troops the signal. Suddenly they darted forth from every point, and swiftly lined the wall. Chapter 28. The enemy, panic-stricken by this unexpected move, were driven from the wall and towers, but formed in wedge-shaped masses in the market-place and open spaces, determined if they were attacked to fight it out, shoulder to shoulder. Seeing that no one would come down on to the level, but that men were swarming all along the wall on every side, they feared that all chance of escape would be gone, and, flinging away their arms, made a rush for the furthest quarter of the town. There some of them, jostling one another in the narrow gateways, were slaughtered by the infantry, and others, after they had got clear of the gates, by the cavalry. Not a man recked of plunder. Exasperated by the massacre at Cenabum and the toil of the siege, they spared not the aged, nor women, nor children. Of the entire garrison, numbering about 40,000, a bare 800, who had fled precipitately from the town on hearing the first outcry, escaped unhurt to Vercingetorix. Late at night he received the fugitives in silence. Fearing that as they came thronging in, the sympathies of the host might be aroused and a riot ensue in the camp, he stationed his trusted associates and the tribal leaders some distance off on the road, and had the fugitives conveyed separately to join their comrades in the section of the camp which had been allotted originally to each tribe. End of chapter 28. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book VII, chapter 29. Next day he called a council of war and consoled his followers, bidding them not be unduly disheartened or disquieted by the disaster. The Romans had not beaten them by superior courage or in a fair fight, but by a kind of trickery, and by their knowledge of siege work, of which they themselves had no experience. It was a mistake to expect invariable success in war. They could testify that he had never approved of defending Avaricum. This reverse was due to the short-sightedness of the Bituriges and the undue complaisance of the other tribes. However, he would soon repair it by successes greater still. By good management he would gain over the dissentient tribes and make the whole of Gaul of one mind, and when Gaul was united, the whole world could not stand against her. This object, indeed, he had already nearly attained. Meanwhile he had a right to expect, in the name of the common weal, that they would take to fortifying their camps, so as to withstand sudden attacks more readily. Chapter 30. This speech made a good impression upon the Gauls. What pleased them most was that, despite a signal disaster, Vercingetorix had not lost heart or concealed himself, or shrunk from facing the multitude. And they gave him all the more credit for foresight and prescience because, before the event, he had voted, first for the burning of Avaricum and afterwards for its abandonment. And so, while a reverse weakens the authority of commanders in general, his prestige, on the contrary, in consequence of the disaster, waxed daily greater. At the same time, relying upon his assurance, they entertained the hope of gaining over the other tribes. Gauls now for the first time began to fortify their camps, and they were so thoroughly frightened that, unused though they were to labour, they felt constrained to submit to every order. Chapter 31. Vercingetorix was as good as his word, and exercised his ingenuity to gain over the other tribes, tempting their chiefs by presents and offers of reward. He chose agents qualified for the purpose, selecting them for the persuasive power which they could severally exercise by plausible speech or good fellowship. He made it his business to provide those who had escaped on the fall of Avaricum with arms and clothing. At the same time, in order to make good his losses, he levied a definite number of recruits from the tribes, fixing the strength of each contingent and the date by which he required them to arrive at headquarters. And he gave orders that all the archers in Gaul, a very numerous body, should be searched for and sent to him. By these measures the losses at Avaricum were speedily repaired. Meanwhile Teutomatus, son of Olovico, king of the Nitiobroges, whose father had received from our Senate the title of friend, joined him with a large body of his own cavalry, and of others from Aquitania, whom he had hired. Chapter 32. Caesar remained several days at Avaricum, where he found an abundance of grain and other stores, and thus enabled the army to recover from their labour and privation. Winter was now nearly over. The propitious season bade him take the field, and he had determined to march against the enemy in the hopes of being able to lure him out of the marshes and forests, or to keep him under close blockade, when the Aeduan magnates came as envoys to beg him to help their country in a serious emergency. The situation, they pleaded, was extremely critical. From remote antiquity the chief magistrates had regularly been appointed one at a time and held sovereign power for 1 year. Now, however, there were 2 in office, each of whom asserted that his appointment was legal. One of them was Convictio Litavis, a young man of influence and distinction; the other Cotus, a scion of a very old family, and moreover a man of commanding position and powerful family connections, whose brother, Valetiacus, had held the same office in the preceding year. The people were up in arms, the council and the commonalty were divided, and the rivals were each supported by their own retainers. If the dispute were prolonged, the result would be civil war. It rested with Caesar to prevent this by his energy and influence. Chapter 33. Caesar considered it detrimental to leave the theatre of war and suspend his operations against the enemy. But he was aware that great disasters commonly arise from civil strife. The Aedui were a powerful tribe, bound by the closest ties to the Roman people. He had always promoted their interests and distinguished them by every mark of favour, and he regarded it as his first duty to prevent them from coming to blows, and the weaker party from applying for aid to Vercingetorix. As the holder of the chief magistracy was forbidden by Aeduan law to leave the country, he determined, in order to avoid the semblance of slighting their rights or their laws, to go in person to their country, and accordingly summoned the whole council and the disputants themselves to meet him at Decetia. There almost all the citizens of note assembled. Caesar was informed that a few persons had been secretly called together, and that one of the rivals had been declared elected by his own brother, in a wrong place and at a wrong time, whereas the law not only forbade 2 members of one family to be appointed while both were alive, but actually prohibited them from sitting in the council. He therefore compelled Cotus to resign, and authorized Convictor Litavis, who had been appointed by the priests in accordance with tribal custom in a period of interregnum, to continue to hold office. Chapter 34. Having stopped the dispute by this decision, Caesar counselled the Aedui to forget their disputes and dissensions, and, putting aside everything else, to devote themselves to the campaign, and look forward to receiving from him the reward which would be their due when Gaul was finally conquered. They were to send him quickly the whole of their cavalry and 10,000 foot, that he might distribute them for the protection of his convoys. He then divided the army into 2 parts. Assigning part of the cavalry to Labienus and retaining the rest, he gave him 4 legions, with which he was to march against the Senones and the Parisii, and advance in person at the head of the remaining 6 towards the country of the Arverni, in the direction of the stronghold of Gergovia, following the course of the Allier. On learning this, Vercingetorix broke down all the bridges over the river, and marched up the opposite bank. Chapter 35. The 2 armies were in full view of one another, and each encamped almost opposite the camp of the other. Patrols were thrown out to prevent the Romans from making a bridge anywhere and throwing their troops across, and thus Caesar was in a very difficult position, for he was in danger of being barred by the river for the greater part of the summer, as the Allier is not generally fordable before the autumn. To prevent this, he encamped in a wooded spot opposite one of the bridges which Vercingetorix had broken down, and next day remained there in concealment with 2 legions. The rest of the force he sent on as usual with all the baggage, breaking up some of the cohorts, so that the number of the legions might appear unchanged. He ordered them to march on as far as possible, and when he inferred from the time of day that they had reached camp, he proceeded to repair the bridge, making use of the original piles, the lower part of which was still entire. The work was rapidly finished, the legions crossed over, and, selecting a suitable spot for his camp, he recalled the other troops. When Vercingetorix found out what had happened, he pushed on ahead by forced marches, in order to avoid being compelled to fight against his will. Chapter 36. From the point where he had halted, Caesar made his way to Gergovia in 5 marches, On the day of his arrival a cavalry skirmish took place. The town, situated upon a lofty hill, was difficult to access on all sides. After making a reconnaissance, Caesar concluded that a regular siege would be hopeless, and he resolved not to attempt a blockade until he had secured his supplies. Vercingetorix had encamped near the town and grouped the contingents of the several tribes at moderate distances from one another and round his own quarters. His force occupied all the high points of the mountain mass, commanding a view over the plain, and presented a formidable appearance. He ordered the tribal chieftains, whom he had chosen to share his counsels, to come to him every morning at daybreak, to communicate intelligence or make arrangements for the defence, and there was hardly a day on which he missed sending his cavalry into action, with archers scattered among their ranks, so as to test the mettle and the soldierly qualities of every man. Opposite the town, and at the very foot of the mountain, there was a hill of great natural strength and scarped on every side. If our troops could occupy it, they would probably be able to cut off the enemy from the principal source of their water supply, and harass their foragers. But they held the place, though with an inadequate force. Notwithstanding, Caesar moved out of his camp in the stillness of night, and before relief could arrive from the town, expelled the garrison, took possession of the place, and posted 2 legions to hold it. From the larger camp to the smaller, he drew a pair of trenches, each 12 feet broad, to enable the men to come and go, even one at a time, secure from any sudden attack. Chapter 37. While these events were passing at Gergovia, Convictolitavis the Aeduan, upon whom, as we have related, Caesar had conferred the chief magistracy, was bribed by the Arverni to join them. He communicated with a number of young men, the most prominent of whom were Litavicus and his brothers, who belonged to a very illustrious family. Sharing the money with them, he urged them to bear in mind that they were free men, born to command. The Aedui, and they alone, prevented Gaul from making sure of success. Their influence kept the other tribes in check, and if it were thrown into the opposite scale, the Romans would have no footing in Gaul. Personally, he was under some obligation to Caesar, though he had fully deserved to win his case, but obligation was outweighed by regard for the national liberty. Why, indeed, should the Aedui submit their rights and laws to the arbitration of Caesar any more than the Romans to that of the Aedui? The young men were speedily won by the magistrate's eloquence and his gold, and promised even to take the lead in his enterprise, and they tried to think of some method of accomplishing it, feeling doubtful whether the community could be lightly induced to embark on war. It was decided that Litavicus should take command of the 10,000 who were to be sent to Caesar to take part in the campaign, and undertake the duty of leading them, and that his brothers should hurry on in advance to join Caesar. At the same time, they arranged the rest of their programme. Chapter 38. Litavicus took command of the army. About 30 miles from Gergovia he suddenly paraded the troops. "Soldiers," he said with a burst of tears, "where are we going? All our cavalry, all our men of rank have perished. 2 of our leading citizens, Eporedorix and Viridomarus, have been falsely charged with treason and put to death by the Romans without trial. Learn the facts from these men, who have fled straight from the massacre. For my brothers and all my kinsfolk are slain, and grief prevents me from telling what has happened." Some men whom he had schooled in their parts came forward, and repeated to the host the tale which Litavicus had told. All the Aeduan cavalry, they said, had been massacred on the rumour that they had been in communication with the Arverni. They had themselves hidden in the crowd of soldiers, and escaped from the midst of the slaughter. With one voice the Aedui adjured Litavicus to consider their safety. "As if," he cried, "it were a case for consideration! As if we were not bound to hurry on to Gergovia and join the Arverni! Can we doubt that the Romans, after the shameful deed they have done, are even now hastening to slay us? Therefore, if we have a spark of courage in us, let us avenge the deaths of our countrymen, who have been most foully murdered, and kill these brigands." Then, pointing to some Roman citizens who had accompanied him in reliance upon his escort, he seized a quantity of corn and other stores belonging to them, cruelly tortured them, and put them to death. Sending messengers throughout the length and breadth of the Aeduan territory, he stirred up the populace by the same lying tale of the massacre of cavalry and chiefs, and urged them to follow his example and avenge their wrongs. Chapter 39. Eporedorix, a young Aeduan of noble birth and commanding influence in his own country, and Viridomarus, a man of the same age and equally popular but of lower birth, had been summoned expressly by Caesar, and had taken the field with the cavalry. Diviciacus had recommended Viridomarus to Caesar, and Caesar had raised him from a humble position to the highest dignity. He and Eporedorix were rivals for power, and in the struggle between the magistrates Eporedorix had been a strong partisan of Convictolitavis, and Viridomarus of Cotus. On learning Litaviccus's design, Eporedorix went to Caesar about midnight and told him the story. He begged him not to suffer the tribe to fall away from its friendship with the Roman people through the misguided counsels of raw youths, telling him that he foresaw that this would happen if such a numerous force joined the enemy, for their kinsmen could not disregard their safety, or the tribe treat it as insignificant. Chapter 40. The news caused Caesar great anxiety, for he had always shown especial favour to the Aeduan community. Without a moment's hesitation, therefore, he left camp at the head of 4 legions in light marching order, and the whole of the cavalry. There was no time at such a crisis to reduce the size of the camp, for success plainly depended upon prompt action. And he left Gaius Fabius to guard it with 2 legions. He ordered Litaviccus's brothers to be arrested, but found that they had escaped to the enemy a short time before. Addressing the men, he urged them not to mind a hard march at so critical a conjuncture. They were all in great heart, and after a march of 25 miles, Caesar descried the Aeduan column, and, sending on his cavalry, delayed and finally stopped their advance, at the same time strictly forbidding all ranks to kill a single man, and telling Eporedorix and Viridomarus, who were supposed by the Aedui to have been killed, to move about among the troopers and speak to their countrymen. As soon as they were recognized, and the Aedui saw that Litaviccus had deceived them, they stretched out their hands in token of surrender, grounding their arms and begging for their lives. Litaviccus escaped to Gergovia, accompanied by his retainers, for Gallic custom brands it as shameful for retainers to desert their lords, even when all is lost. Chapter 41. Caesar sent messengers to the Aedui to explain that, as an act of favour, he had spared men whom the rights of war would have entitled him to put to death, and after giving the army 3 hours in the night to rest, he moved on towards Gergovia. About half-way, some horsemen, sent by Fabius, met him, and reported that the camp had been in imminent danger. The entire force of the enemy, they said, had attacked it, fresh men frequently relieving their comrades when they were tired, and wearing out our troops by incessant toil, as, on account of its great extent, they had to keep constantly on the rampart without relief. Many had been wounded by showers of arrows and missiles of every kind, but the artillery had been of great use in enabling them to hold out. When the enemy retired, Fabius was blocking up all the gates except 2, strengthening the rampart with breastworks, and preparing to meet a similar attack on the morrow. On receiving this intelligence, Caesar pushed on, and, thanks to the extraordinary energy of the men, reached camp before sunrise. End of chapter 41. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translation by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 7, Chapter 42. While these events were passing at Gergovia, the Aedui received Litaviccus's first message. Leaving themselves no time to find out the truth, they were impelled, some by greed, others by anger and rashness, an innate quality of the race, to take an idle rumour for an ascertained fact. They plundered Roman citizens, murdered them, kidnapped and enslaved them. Convictolitavis added fuel to the flame, and hounded on the masses to frenzy, in the hope that, once committed, they would feel ashamed to return to reason. Marcus Aristius, a military tribune, was on his way to join his legion. They promised him a safe conduct, and made him quit the town of Cabillonum, compelling the Romans who had settled there for trade to depart also. Forthwith they fell upon them on the road, and robbed them of all their baggage. The Romans resisted, and their assailants beset them all day and the following night. Many were killed on both sides, and the assailants roused numbers to arm. Chapter 43. Meanwhile news arrived that all their infantry were in Caesar's power. Hurrying to Aristeus, they explained that the government was not responsible for anything, and ordering an inquiry about the plundered property, they confiscated the goods of Litaviccus and his brothers, and sent envoys to make their excuses to Caesar. Their motive was to get their countrymen restored, but, stained with crime, fascinated by the profits of plunder, for many had had a hand in the outrages, and dreading retribution, they began to make secret preparations for war, and sent embassies to gain over the other tribes. Caesar was aware of their designs. Nevertheless he spoke to their envoys with all possible gentleness, assuring them that he would not judge the whole people harshly because of the ignorant folly of the masses, or abate his good will towards the Aedui. Anticipating that the insurrection in Gaul would spread, and desiring to avoid being surrounded by all the tribes, he began to think out a plan for withdrawing from the neighbourhood of Gergovia, and once more concentrating the whole army in such a way that his departure might not be attributed to fear of a general defection and resemble a flight. Chapter 44. While he was meditating on this problem, he thought he saw an opportunity of striking a telling blow. Going to the smaller camp to inspect the works, he noticed that a hill in the possession of the enemy was completely deserted, whereas before it could hardly be discerned for their number. In astonishment he inquired of the deserters, who daily flocked to join him in great numbers, what was the reason. They were all agreed, and Caesar had already found out the same thing for himself through his patrols, that the ridge to which the hill belonged was nearly level, but where it gave access to the further side of the town, wooded and narrow. The Gauls were intensely anxious for the safety of this place, and one hill being already held by the Romans, they now felt sure that, if they lost the other, they would be all but surrounded, fairly cut off from all egress, and prevented from foraging. Every man, therefore, had been called away by Vercingetorix to fortify the position. Chapter 45. On learning this, Caesar sent several squadrons of cavalry thither about midnight, ordering them to rove all over the country and make a good deal of noise. At daybreak he ordered a large number of pack horses and mules to be taken out of camp, the pack saddles to be taken off, and the drivers to put on helmets, so as to look like troopers, and ride round over the hills. He sent a few regular cavalry with them, with orders to wander further afield, so as to increase the effect. All were to make a wide circuit and head towards the same goal. These movements could be seen far off from the town, as Gergovia commanded a view of the camp, but it was impossible at such a distance to make out exactly what they meant. A single legion was sent along the same chain, and after it had advanced a little way it was stationed on lower ground and concealed in the woods. The suspicions of the Gauls were intensified, and they transferred all their forces to the threatened point to help in the work of fortification. Noticing that the enemy's camps were deserted, Caesar made his soldiers cover their crests and hide their standards, and move, a few at a time, to avoid being observed from the town, from the larger to the smaller camp. At the same time he explained his plans to his generals, each of whom he had placed in command of a legion, warning them above all to keep the men in hand, and not let them advance too far from over-eagerness for fighting or lust for plunder. He pointed out that the unfavourable ground placed them at a disadvantage, which could only be avoided by moving quickly. It was a case for a surprise, not a regular battle. Having made these instructions clear, he gave the signal, at the same time sending the Aedui up the hill by another path on the right. Chapter 46. The wall of the town was 9 furlongs in a straight line from the plain, where the ascent began, without reckoning any bend. The turns that were necessary for easing the slope added so much to the length of the climb. About half way up, running lengthways in the direction indicated by the formation of the mountain, the Gauls had built a wall 6 feet high, of large stones, to check any attack by our men. All the space below was left unoccupied, but the higher part of the hill, up to the wall of the town, was thickly covered by their camps. When the signal was given, the men rapidly gained the outer line of defence, clambered over it, and took possession of 3 camps. They did this so quickly that Teutomatus, king of the Nitiobroges, was surprised in his tent where he was taking his siesta, and only just broke away, naked to the waist and with his horse wounded, from the clutches of the plundering soldiers. Chapter 47. Having achieved his purpose, Caesar ordered the recall to be sounded, and immediately halted the 10th legion, which he commanded in person. The men of the other legions did not hear the sound of the trumpet, as a considerable valley intervened, till the tribunes and the generals, in obedience to Caesar's command, tried to keep them in hand. Elated, however, by the expectation of a speedy triumph, by the enemy's flight, and by the recollection of past victories, they fancied that nothing was too difficult for their valour to achieve, and pressed on in pursuit till they got close to the wall and gates of the fortress. Then a cry arose from every part of the town, and those who were some way off, panic-stricken by the sudden uproar, and believing that the enemy were inside the gates, rushed pell-mell out of the stronghold. Matrons flung down clothes and money from the wall, and leaning over with breasts bare, stretched forth their hands and besought the Romans to spare them, and not to refuse quarter even to women and children, as they had done at Avaricum, while some were let down from the walls and gave themselves up to the soldiers. Lucius Fabius, a centurion of the 8th legion, who was known to have said that day, in the hearing of his men, that he was fired by the recollection of the rewards that had been offered at Avaricum, and would suffer no man to mount the wall before him, got 3 men of his company, and, being hoisted up by them, clambered up the wall, then in turn hauling them up one by one, he lifted them on to it. Chapter 48. Meanwhile the men who, as we have pointed out above, had assembled near the other end of the town to fortify the position, heard the outcry, and presently, stimulated by a succession of messages telling them that the town was in the hands of the Romans, sent on horsemen ahead and hurried up at a great pace. Each man, as he successively arrived, took his stand under the wall and swelled the number of his comrades. And now a great multitude had assembled, and the matrons, who a moment before had been holding out their hands to the Romans from the wall, began to adjure their menfolk, and displayed their streaming locks, as Gallic women do, and brought out their children for all to see. It was no fair fight for the Romans. The ground was unfavourable, their numbers were inferior, and tired out by their rapid climb and the protracted combat, they could not well hold their own against men who had just come fresh into action. Chapter 49. Caesar, seeing that the fight was not on a fair field, and that the enemy's force was increasing, became anxious for the safety of his men, and sent an order to Titus Sextius, the general whom he had left in charge of the smaller camp, to take his cohorts out quickly, and form them up at the foot of the hill, on the enemy's right flank, so as to check their pursuit in case he saw our men driven from their position. Advancing a little with his own legion from the position which he had taken up, he awaited the issue of the combat. Fierce fighting was going on, the enemy relying upon position and numbers, our men upon valour, when suddenly the Aedui, whom Caesar had sent up by another path on the right to create a diversion, were descried on our exposed flank. Being armed like Gauls, they caused a violent panic among our men, and although it was noticed that their right shoulders were bare, the recognized symbol of peace, yet the soldiers fancied that they were foes and had done this on purpose to deceive them. At the same moment the centurion, Lucius Fabius, and the men who had climbed the wall along with him were surrounded and killed, and their bodies pitched down from the wall. Marcus Petronius, a centurion of the same legion, made an attempt to hew down the gates, but overwhelmed by numbers, desperate, and covered with wounds, he said to the men of his company who had followed him, "Since I cannot save myself and you, I will at all events try to save your lives, for it was I, in my lust for glory, who brought you into danger. You have your chance, use it." With these words he dashed in among the enemy, killed 2 of them, and forced the rest back a little way from the gate. His men attempted to help him. "It's useless," he cried, "for you to try and save my life, for blood and strength are ebbing. Go then, while you have the chance, and return to your legion." So he fought, and soon fell, and so he saved his men. Chapter 51. Overborne at every point, the Romans were driven from their position with the loss of 46 centurions. The Gauls were relentlessly pursuing when the 10th legion, which had taken post in reserve on comparatively favourable ground, checked them, and the 10th was in its turn supported by the cohorts of the 13th, which had quitted the smaller camp under Titus Sextius, and occupied a commanding position. The moment the legions reached the plain they halted and showed a bold front to the enemy, and Vercingetorix withdrew his men from the foot of the hill into his entrenchments. Nearly 700 men were lost that day. End of chapter 52.
Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes, Book 7, Chapter 52. Next day Caesar paraded his troops, and reprimanded them for the rashness and impetuosity which they had shown in judging for themselves how far they were to advance, and what they were to do, not halting when the signal was given for recall, and refusing to submit to the control of the tribunes and the generals. He explained that an unfavourable position made a serious difference. He had experienced this himself at Avaricum, when, though he had had the enemy in his grasp without their general and without their cavalry, he had foregone an assured triumph for fear the unfavourable ground should entail a loss, however slight, in the action. He heartily admired their heroic spirit, which entrenched camp and high mountain and walled fortresses were powerless to daunt, but just as heartily he reprobated their contempt for discipline, and their presumption in imagining that they knew how to win battles and forecast results better than their general. He required from his soldiers obedience and self-control just as much as courage and heroism. 53. After this harangue, Caesar, in conclusion, encouraged the men, telling them not to let an incident like this trouble them, and not to ascribe to the enemy's courage a result which had been brought about by the unfavourable nature of the ground. His intention of abandoning Gergovia being unchanged, he led their legions out of camp, and formed them in line of battle on a good position. Still Vercingetorix did not venture down on to the level. A cavalry skirmish followed, which resulted in favour of the Romans, and Caesar then withdrew his army into camp. Next day he fought a similar action, and then, thinking that he had done enough to humble the vainglory of the Gauls and to restore the confidence of his soldiers, he marched for the country of the Aedui. Even then the enemy did not pursue. 2 days later Caesar repaired a bridge over the Allier and threw his army across. 54. At this stage the Aeduans, Viridomarus and Epidaurus, approached and accosted him. He learned that Ludovicus had gone off with all the cavalry to work upon the Aedui. It was essential, they urged, that they should be beforehand, in order to keep the tribe steady. By this time Caesar saw clearly from many signs that the Aedui were traitors, and he was of opinion that the departure of these men would hasten their defection. Still he did not think it right to detain them, for he desired to avoid the semblance of injustice, and not lay himself open to the suspicion of fear. As they were leaving, he told them briefly what he had done for the Aedui, pointing out how they were situated and how low they had fallen when his connection with them began, driven into their strongholds, their lands confiscated and their allies all taken from them, tribute imposed upon them and hostages wrung from them with the grossest insults. Then how he had raised them to such prosperity and power that they not only regained their former position, but acquired, in the sight of all, a prestige and influence which they had never enjoyed before. With this reminder he let them go. 55. There was an Aeduan town, advantageously situated on the banks of the Loire, called Noviodunum. Thither Caesar had conveyed all the hostages of Gaul, his grain, the public moneys, and a large portion of his own baggage and that of the army. Thither too he had sent a large number of horses, which he had purchased in Italy and Spain for the war. On reaching the town, Epidaurus and Viridomarus ascertained the attitude of their tribe. Ludovicius had been received by the Aedui at Bebracte, the most influential town in the country. Convictor Lativus, the first magistrate, and a large proportion of the council had assembled to meet him, and envoys had been officially dispatched to Vercingetorix to effect a friendly understanding. An opportunity like this, they thought, was not to be missed. Accordingly, they massacred the guard at Noviodanum and the individuals who had settled there for trade, and divided the treasure and the horses, arranged for the conveyance of the hostages of the several tribes to the magistrate of Bracte, burned the town, which they considered it impossible to hold, to prevent its being of use to the Romans, carried away in barges as much grain as they could hurriedly stow away, and threw the rest into the river or burned it. They then proceeded to raise forces from the neighbouring districts, establishing detachments and piquets along the banks of the Loire, and throwing out cavalry in all directions to terrorize the Romans, in the hope of being able to prevent them from getting corn, or to drive them, under stress of destitution, to make for the province. It was a strong point in their favour that the Loire was swollen from the melting of the snow, so that, to all appearance, it was quite unfordable. 56. On learning this, Caesar decided that he must act at once, so that, in case it should be necessary to take the risk of bridging the river, he might be able to fight before reinforcements came up. To change his whole plan of campaign and march for the province, that he deemed was a course to which he ought not to allow even the pressure of fear to force him. For the disgrace and the humiliation of retreat, the barrier interposed by the Cevennes, and the condition of the roads forbade him to attempt it, and above all he was intensely anxious for Labienus, who was separated from him, and for the legions which he had placed under his command. Accordingly he made a series of extraordinary marches by day and night, reached the Loire before anyone had expected him, and discovered a ford by the help of the cavalry, which was good enough for an emergency, the men being just able to keep their arms and shoulders above water to carry their weapons. The cavalry were formed in line to break the force of the current, and, the enemy flying in confusion at the first sight of the army, he brought it safely across. Having satisfied its wants with corn and large numbers of cattle, which he found in the district, he pushed on for the country of the Senones. 57. While Caesar was engaged in these operations, Labienus marched for Lutetia with his 4 legions, leaving the draft which had recently arrived from Italy at Agedincum to protect the heavy baggage. Lutetia is a town belonging to the Parisii, situated on an island in the river Seine. When the enemy became aware of his approach, large forces assembled from the neighbouring tribes. The chief command was conferred upon an Aulercan named Camulogenus, who, though old and worn, was called to this high place because of his uncommon knowledge of war. Observing that there was a continuous march, which drained into the Seine and rendered the whole country in its neighbourhood impassable, he took post behind it and prepared to stop our men from crossing. 58. Labienus at first formed a line of sheds and attempted to fill up the marsh with fascines and other material, and thus make a causeway across. Finding this scarcely practicable, he silently quitted his camp in the 3rd watch, and made his way, by the route by which he had advanced, to Metiosedum, a town belonging to the Senones, situated like Lutetia, of which we have just spoken, on an island in the Seine. Labienus seized about 50 barges, rapidly lashed them together, and threw the troops onto them. The townspeople, many of whom had been summoned into the field, were paralyzed with astonishment and fear, and Labienus took the town without a blow. After repairing the bridge, which the enemy had recently broken down, he made the army cross over, and marched on, following the course of the stream, in the direction of Lutetia. The enemy, informed of what he had done by fugitives from Metiosedum, gave orders that Lutetia should be burned and its bridges broken down. Then, moving away from the marsh, they encamped on the banks of the Seine, opposite Lutetia, and over against the camp of Labienus. 59. By this time it was known that Caesar had abandoned his position at Gergovia. By this time, too, rumours were arriving about the defection of the Aedui and the success of the Gallic insurrection, and the Gauls, in their gossip with the Romans, affirmed that Caesar was prevented from pursuing his march and from crossing the Loire, and that want of corn had forced him to make a dash for the province. The Bellovaci, moreover, who were already and spontaneously disaffected, on learning that the Aedui had gone over, began to raise troops and to make overt preparations for war. Now that the situation had so completely changed, Labienus saw that he must completely alter his original plan. What he thought of now was not how to gain some positive advantage and force the enemy to an engagement, but how to get his army safely back to Agedincum. On one side he was menaced by the Bellovaci, who have the greatest reputation, as fighting men, of any tribe in Gaul. On the other, Camulogenus held the field with a well-formed army, ready for action, while a great river separated the legions from their baggage and the troops which protected it. With these formidable difficulties suddenly confronting him, he saw that he must look for aid to the force of his own character. 60. Towards evening he assembled his officers, and charging them to carry out his orders to the letter, placed one of the Roman knights in charge of each of the barges which he had brought down from Metiosedum, and ordered them to move silently 4 miles downstream at the end of the first watch, and wait for him there. Leaving 5 cohorts, which he believed to be the least steady in action, to hold the camp, he ordered the remaining 5 of the same legion to move up the river about midnight with the whole baggage train, and make a great noise. He also procured a number of small boats, and sent them in the same direction, the rowers making a great splash with their oars. Soon afterwards he silently moved out of the camp with 3 legions, and made for the spot to which he had ordered the barges to be rowed. 61. When the legions reached the spot, the enemy's patrols were surprised at their post all along the river by our troops, for a great storm had sprung up suddenly, and cut down. Infantry and cavalry were swiftly ferried across under the superintendence of the Roman knights, whom Labienus had charged with the duty. Just before dawn, and almost simultaneously, the enemy were informed that an unusual commotion was going on in the Roman camp, that a large column was moving up the river, and that the sound of oars audible in the same direction, and that troops were being ferried across a little lower down. On hearing this, they imagined that the legions were crossing at 3 places, and that the Romans, in alarm at the defection of the Aedui, were all preparing for flight. Accordingly, they made a corresponding distribution of their own troops, leaving a force opposite the Roman camp, and sending a small body in the direction of Metiosedum, with orders to advance as far as the boats had gone. They led the rest of their troops against Labienus. 62. By daybreak the whole of our troops were ferried across, and the enemy's line was discernible. Labienus, bidding the soldiers remember their ancient valour and their many splendid victories, and imagine that Caesar, under whose command they had many times beaten the enemy, was present in person, gave the signal for action. At the first onset, the right wing, where the 7th Legion stood, drove back the enemy and put them to flight. The 12th Legion occupied the left. There the enemy's foremost ranks fell, transfixed by javelins. But the other ranks vigorously resisted, and not a man laid himself open to the suspicion of cowardice. Camulogenus, the enemy's commander, supported his men by his presence and cheered them on. And now, when the victory was still doubtful, the tribunes of the 7th Legion, who had been told of what was passing on the left wing, made the legion show itself on the enemy's rear, and charged. Even in that moment not a man quitted his post, but all were surrounded and slain. Camulogenus shared their fate. The detachment which had been left on guard opposite Labienus' camp, on hearing that the battle had begun, went to the support of their comrades, and occupied a hill. But they could not withstand the onset of our victorious soldiery. Mingling with their flying comrades, they were slain, all who failed to find shelter in the woods and on the hills, by the Roman cavalry. Labienus' task was accomplished. He returned to Agedincum, where he had left the heavy baggage of the whole army, and thence made his way, with his entire force, to the quarters of Caesar. 63. When the defection of the Aedui became known, the gravity of the war increased. Embassies were dispatched in all directions. The Aedui exerting all their influence, prestige, and pecuniary resources to win over the tribes, and having in their power the hostages whom Caesar had left in their country, they intimidated waverers by threatening to kill them. They requested Vercingetorix to visit them and concert with them a plan of campaign, and when he complied, they insisted that the supreme control should be transferred to them. The demand was disputed, and a pan-Gallic council was convened at Bibracte. Delegates flocked thither in numbers. The question was put to the vote, and the delegates unanimously confirmed the appointment of Vercingetorix as commander-in-chief. The Remi, Lingones, and Treveri were not represented in the council, the 2 former because they adhered to their friendship with the Romans, the Treveri because they were far away and were themselves hard pressed by the Germans, for which reason they kept aloof all through the war and remained neutral. The Aedui, bitterly chagrined at being ousted from the supremacy, lamented their change of fortune and sorely missed Caesar's favour. Yet having taken up arms, they dared not sever themselves from the other tribes. Reluctantly those ambitious young leaders, Epidaurus, Viridomarus, obeyed Vercingetorix. 64. The commander-in-chief ordered the newly joined tribes to give hostages, fixing a date for their arrival, and directed all the cavalry, numbering 15,000, to assemble speedily. He announced that he would content himself with the infantry which he had already, and would not tempt fortune by fighting a battle, for, as he was strong in cavalry, it would be quite easy to prevent the Romans from getting corn and forage, only that the patriots destroy their own corn and burn their homesteads in the certainty that by this personal sacrifice they were securing independence and liberty for evermore. Having made these arrangements, he ordered the Aedui and the Segusiavi, who were conterminous with the province, to furnish 10,000 cavalry, which he reinforced by 800 cavalry, and placing Epidauric's brother in command, directed him to attack the Allobroges. In another quarter he sent the Gabali and the Arvernian clans nearest to the Helvi to attack that people, and the Rutini and Cadurci to devastate the territory of the Volcae Eromici. At the same time he attempted by secret emissaries and embassies to gain over the Allobroges, promising money to the leading men, and to the tribe domination over the whole province, for he hoped that they had not yet forgotten the late war. 65. To meet these emergencies there were detachments in readiness, amounting to 22 cohorts, which had been raised by Lucius Caesar, a general officer from the whole province, and were posted to meet every attack. The Helvi, who encountered the neighbouring clans on their own initiative, were defeated with the loss of Gaius Valerius Domitiorus, the first magistrate, and many others, and forced to take refuge in strongholds and behind walls. The Allobroges posted a chain of pickets along the Rhone, and defended their own territory with great care and vigilance. Caesar, being aware of the enemy's superiority in cavalry, and unable to get any assistance from the province and Italy as all the roads were blocked, sent across the Rhine to the tribes of Germany which he had subdued in former years, and called into the field cavalry with the light-armed foot which habitually fight in their ranks. On their arrival, as their horses were unserviceable, he took those of the tribunes and other Roman knights, and also of the time-expired volunteers, and assigned them to the Germans. 66. During these operations, the enemy's Arvernian forces and the cavalry, levied from the whole of Gaul, were assembling. Vercingetorix collected a large number of these troops, and while Caesar was marching through the most distant part of the country of the Lingones, toward the country of the Sequani, that he might be in a better position for reinforcing the province, took post in 3 camps about 10 miles from the Romans. Summoning his cavalry officers to a council of war, he told them that the hour of victory had come. The Romans were retreating to the province and abandoning Gaul. This would secure liberty for the time, but for lasting peace and tranquillity the gain was small, for they would come back in increased force and continue the war indefinitely. The cavalry, then, must attack them on the march, while they were helpless. If the infantry stopped to support their comrades, they could not continue their march. If, as he thought more likely, they abandoned their baggage and tried to save themselves, they would lose indispensable materiel as well as prestige. As for the enemy's cavalry, they, at any rate, ought not to doubt that not a man of them would dare so much as stir outside the column. To encourage them in their attack, he would post all his troops in front of the camps and overawe the enemy. With one voice the knights exclaimed that every man must be sworn by a solemn oath to ride twice through the enemy's column, or never be admitted beneath the roof, never come nigh unto children, or parents, or wife. 67. The proposal was approved, and every man was sworn. Next day the cavalry were divided into 3 sections, 2 of which made a demonstration on either flank, while the third checked the advance of the vanguard. When the movement was reported, Caesar in turn divided his cavalry into 3 parts, and ordered them to advance against the enemy. The combat became general. The column halted, and the baggage was brought into the intervals between the legions. When, at any point, our men appeared to be in difficulties or actually overmatched, Caesar made the infantry advance in their direction and form in line. These tactics prevented the enemy from following up their advantage, and encouraged our men by the assurance of support. At length the Germans occupied the summit of a ridge on the right flank, dislodged the enemy, and drove them en route with heavy loss to a stream where Vercingetorix had taken post with his infantry. Observing this, the rest of the cavalry were afraid of being surrounded, and took to flight. The whole field was a scene of carnage. 3 Aeduans of the highest rank were brought prisoners to Caesar: Cotus, commandant of the cavalry, who had disputed the claims of Convictio at the recent election; Cavarilus, who had taken command of the infantry after the defection of Litovicus; Epidauricus, who had commanded the Aedui in their war with the Sequani before Caesar's arrival. 68. After the total defeat of his cavalry, Vercingetorix withdrew his infantry from the position which he had taken up in front of the camps, and ordering his baggage train to leave camp quickly and follow him, marched forthwith for Alesia, a stronghold of the Mandubii. Caesar removed his baggage to a hill close by, and leaving 2 legions to guard it, kept up the pursuit as long as daylight permitted, killing about 3,000 of the enemy's rearguard, and encamped next day in the neighbourhood of Alesia. The enemy were cowed by the defeat of their cavalry, the arm in which they had their greatest confidence. Accordingly, after connoitering the position, he called upon the soldiers to brace themselves for an effort, and proceeded to form a contravallation. 69. The fortress stood on top of a hill, in a very commanding position, being apparently impregnable except by blockade. The base of the hill was washed on two sides by two streams. In front of the town extended a plain about 3 miles in length, and on every other side it was surrounded, at a moderate distance, by hills of elevation equal to its own. Toward the wall, on the side of the hill which looked towards the east, the whole space was crowded with the Gallic troops, who had fortified it with a ditch and a wall of loose stones, 6 feet high. The perimeter of the works which the Romans were about to construct covered 11 miles. Camps were established in convenient positions, and in their neighbourhood 23 redoubts were constructed, in which pickets were posted during the day to prevent any sudden sortie, while at night they were guarded by strong bivouacs. 70. After the commencement of the works, a cavalry combat took place in the plain which, as we have explained above, formed a gap in the hills, extending 3 miles in length. Both sides fought their hardest. As our men were in difficulties, Caesar sent the Germans to support them, and drew up the legions in front of the camps to prevent any sudden attack by the enemy's infantry. Supported by the legions, our men gathered confidence. The enemy were put to flight, and hampered by their own numbers, got jammed in the gateways, which had been left too narrow. The Germans hotly pursued them right up to the entrenchments. The carnage was great, and some of the fugitives dismounted and tried to cross the ditch and climb over the wall. Caesar ordered the legions which he had drawn up in front of the ramparts to advance a little. The Gauls, inside the entrenchments, were not less terrified than the fugitives, and believing that they would speedily be attacked, shouted, "To arms!" while some rushed panic-stricken into the town. Vercingetorix ordered the gates to be shut, to prevent the camp from being deserted, and the Germans, having killed a great many men and captured a number of horses, returned. 71. Vercingetorix now determined to send away all his cavalry in the night, before the Romans had time to complete the entrenchments. As they were moving off, he bade them go, every man to his own country, and make all who were of an age to bear arms take the field. Reminding them of his own services, he adjured them to have some regard for his safety, and not to give up one who had served so well the cause of national liberty to be tortured by the enemy. If they did not bestir themselves, he told them, 80,000 picked men would perish with him. He calculated that he had corn enough to last barely 30 days, but by reducing the rations it might be possible to hold out a little longer. With these instructions he silently sent out the cavalry, in the second watch, through a gap in the works. He ordered all the grain to be brought to him, giving notice that those who disobeyed should be put to death, distributed the livestock, of which a great quantity had been driven in by the Mandubii, individually among the garrison, made arrangements for doling out the grain gradually, and withdrew into the town all the forces which he had posted in front of it. In this way he prepared to fight on and await the Gallic reinforcements. End of chapter 71. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 7, Chapter 72. Being informed of what had passed by deserters and prisoners, Caesar planned defensive works of the following kind. Constructing a trench 20 feet wide with vertical sides, the width at the bottom being exactly equal to the distance between its upper edges, he traced out all the remaining works 800 paces behind it, his object being, as he was obliged to cover such a vast extent of ground and it was not easy to man the whole system of works with an unbroken ring of troops, to prevent the enemy from swooping down unexpectedly upon the lines in force at night, or in the daytime discharging missiles at the men while they were at work. Leaving this interval, he dug 2 trenches of equal depth, each 15 feet wide, and filled the inner one, where it crossed the plain and the low ground, with water drawn from the stream. Behind the trenches he constructed a rampart and palisade 12 feet high, which he strengthened by an embattled breastwork, with large forked branches projecting along the line where the breastwork joined the rampart, to check the ascent of the enemy, and erected towers on the entire circuit of the works at intervals of 80 feet. Chapter 73. While these vast fortifications were being constructed, it was necessary to fetch timber and corn, and the troops, having to move considerable distances from camp, were unavoidably weakened. Sometimes, indeed, the Gauls attempted to storm our works and made furious sallies from the town by several gates. Caesar therefore thought it necessary to strengthen the works still further, in order to render the lines defensible by a smaller force. Accordingly, trees or very stout branches were cut down, and their ends stripped of their bark and sharpened to a point. Continuous trenches were then dug, 5 feet deep, in which the logs were planted and fastened down at the bottom to prevent their being dragged out, while the boughs projected above. There were 5 rows in each trench, connected with one another and interlaced, and all who stepped in would impale themselves on the sharp stakes. The men called them gravestones. In front of them, arranged in slanting rows in the form of a quincunx, pits were dug, 3 feet deep, which tapered gradually toward the bottom. Smooth logs as thick as a man's thigh, sharpened at the top and hardened by fire, were planted in them, projecting not more than 4 fingers above the ground. At the same time the earth was trampled down to the depth of 1 foot above the bottom, to keep them firmly in position, while the rest of the pit was covered with twigs and brushwood to hide the trap. There were 8 rows of this kind, 3 feet apart. The men called them lilies, from their resemblance to that flower. In front of them blocks of wood, 1 foot long, with barbed iron spikes let into them, were completely buried in the earth, and scattered about in all directions at moderate intervals. The men called them spurs. Chapter 74. When these defences were completed, Caesar constructed, along the most suitable tracks which the lie of the country enabled him to follow, embracing a circuit of 14 miles, corresponding works of the same kind, facing the opposite way, to repel the enemy from without, so as to prevent the troops who defended the lines from being hemmed in by any force, however numerous, and in order to avoid the danger of having to leave camp, he directed all the troops to provide themselves with fodder and corn for 30 days. Chapter 75. While this was going on at Alesia, the Gauls convened a council of their leading men, who decided not to adopt Vercingetorix's plan of assembling all who could bear arms, but to levy a definite contingent from each tribe, for they were afraid that with such a vast multitude crowding together, they would not be able to control their respective contingents, or keep them apart, or to organize any system for providing grain. The Aedui, with their dependents, the Segusiavi, Ambivareti, and Aulerci Branovices, were ordered to find 35,000 men. The Arverni, along with the Eleuterati, Carducci, Gabali, and Valavi, who are habituated to their sway. The same number, the Sequani, Senones, Biturigis, Santoni, Rutini, and Carnutes, each 12,000. The Bellovaci, 10,000, and the Lemovices the same. The Pictones, Turoni, Parisi, and Helveti, each 8,000. The Andes, Ambiani, Mediomatrici, Petrocori, Nervi, Morini, and Nitiobroges, each 6,000. The Aulerci Cenomani, 5,000, and the Atrabats the same. The Velocecases, 4,000. The Aulerci Eburovices, 3,000. The Aurici and Boi, each 2,000, and all the maritime tribes conjointly, which the Gauls usually call Armorican, including the Coriosolites, Redones, Ambivari, Caletes, Osimi, Veneti, Lemovices, and Venelli, 30,000. The Bellovaci did not furnish their proper contingent, saying that they would fight the Romans on their own account, just as they pleased, and not submit to the dictation of any one. However, at the request of Commius, and in consideration of their friendly relations with him, they sent 2,000 men along with the rest. Chapter 76. Caesar, as we have already mentioned, had found Commius a loyal and serviceable agent in former years in Britain, and in acknowledgment of these services, he had granted his tribe immunity from taxation, restored to it its rights and laws, and placed the Morini under his authority. Yet so intense was the unanimous determination of the entire Gallic people to establish their liberty and recover their ancient military renown, that no favours, no recollection of former friendship, had any influence with them, but all devoted their energies and resources to the prosecution of the war. 8,000 horse and about 250,000 foot were raised. They were reviewed and numbered in the country of the Aedui, and their officers appointed. The Atrebatian, Commius, the two Aeduans, Virodomarus and Epirodorix, and Vercassivellaunus, an Arvernian and kinsman of Vercingetorix, were entrusted with the command. Delegates from the various tribes were associated with them, in accordance with whose advice they were to conduct the campaign. All started for Alesia in high spirits and full of confidence, and there was not one of them who did not believe that the mere appearance of so vast a host would be irresistible, especially as the fighting would be on two fronts, the besieged sallying forth from the town, while without would be conspicuous those huge hosts of cavalry and infantry. Chapter 77. But the besieged in Alesia knew nothing of what was going on in the country of the Aedui. The day on which they had expected their countrymen to succour them was past, and their grain was all consumed. A council of war was therefore convened, and they considered what was to become of them. Various opinions were mooted. Some advised surrender, others a sortie while their strength held out. But Critognatus, an Arvenian of noble family and acknowledged influence, made a speech, which, in view of its singular and atrocious cruelty, ought not, I think, to be passed over. I do not intend, he said, to notice the view of those who dignified the most abject slavery by the title of surrender, for I hold that they ought not to be counted as citizens or admitted to a council. I am only concerned with those who are in favour of a sortie, for, as you are all agreed, in their council is to be recognized the memory of our ancient valour. To be unable to bear privation for a short span, that I call weakness, not manly resolution. It is easier to find men who will affront death than men who will patiently endure suffering. And yet I would give my sanction to this view, so highly do I respect the authority of its advocates, if I saw no evil involved in it save the sacrifice of our own lives, but in forming our plans we must have regard to the whole of Gaul, for we have called upon the whole of Gaul to help us. If 80,000 men fall on one field, what, think you, will be the feelings of our friends and kinsmen when they are constrained to fight almost on the very corpses of the slain? To save you, they have counted their personal danger as nothing. Do not, then, rob them of your aid. Do not, by your folly and rashness or lack of resolution, ruin the whole of Gaul and subject it to perpetual slavery. Can it be that, because they have not arrived punctually to the day, you doubt their good faith and resolution? What then? Do you suppose that the Romans are toiling day after day on those outer lines, simply to amuse themselves? If the messengers of your countrymen cannot reassure you because all ingress is barred, accept Roman testimony that their coming is near. Dread of that event keeps them busy upon their works night and day. What then is my counsel? I counsel you to do what our fathers did in their war with the Cimbri and Teutoni, a war in no way comparable to this. Forced into their strongholds and brought low, like us, by famine, they kept themselves alive by feeding upon the flesh of those whose age disqualified them for war, but they did not surrender to the enemy. And if we had no precedent for this, still, in the name of liberty, I would hold it a most glorious precedent to create and bequeath to posterity. For what resemblance was there between that war and this? The Cimbri devastated Gaul and brought upon her grievous calamity, but they did at last leave our country and seek other lands. They did leave us our rights, our laws, our lands, our liberty. But the Romans, what aim, what purpose have they but this? From mere envy to settle in these lands and tribal territories of a people whose renown and warlike prowess they have come to know, and to fasten upon them the yoke of everlasting slavery? Never have they made war on any other principle. If you know not what is going on among distant peoples, look at the Gaul on your border. Reduced to a province, its rights and laws revolutionized, prostrate beneath the lictor's axe, it is crushed by perpetual slavery. Chapter 78. The votes were recorded. It was decided that those whose age or infirmity disqualified them from fighting should leave the town, that the rest should try every expedient before having recourse to Critognatus' proposal, but that, if circumstances were too strong, and the reinforcements delayed, they should adopt it rather than stoop to accept terms of surrender or peace. The Mandubii, who had admitted them into the town, were compelled to leave with their wives and children. When they reached the lines, they earnestly entreated the Romans with tears to receive them as slaves, only give them something to eat. but Caesar posted guards on the rampart and forbade them admission. Chapter 79. Meanwhile, Commius and the other leaders who had been entrusted with the command reached Alesia with their whole force, and occupying a hill outside, encamped not more than a mile from our entrenchments. Next day they moved their cavalry out of camp, occupied the whole plain which, as we have shown, extends 3 miles in length, and drawing back their infantry a little, posted them on the high ground. The town of Alesia commanded a view over the plain. Descrying the reinforcements, the besieged crowded together and congratulated each other, and all were joyfully excited. Leading their forces to the front, they took post before the town, filled up the nearest trench with fascines covered with earth, and made ready for a sortie and for every hazard. Chapter 80. Disposing his whole force on both lines of entrenchment, so that every man might know his proper place and keep it, ready for emergencies, Caesar ordered the cavalry to move out of camp and engage. All the camps which crowned the surrounding heights commanded a view of the field, and all the soldiers were intently awaiting the issue of the combat. Here and there among the cavalry the Gauls had scattered archers and active light-armed foot, to support their comrades in case they gave way, and withstand the charges of our cavalry. A good many men were wounded by these troops, whose attack they had not foreseen, and left the field. Feeling sure that their countrymen were winning, and observing that our men were being overpowered by numbers, the beleaguered Gauls, as well as those who had come to rescue them, cheered and yelled on every side to encourage their comrades. As the fighting was going on in full view of every one, and no gallant deed, no cowardice, could escape notice, love of glory and fear of disgrace stimulated both sides to valour. From noon till near sunset the fight went on, and still the issue was doubtful. At length the Germans massed their squadrons at one point, and charged and forced back the enemy, and on their flight the archers were surrounded and slain. The other divisions likewise falling back, our men gave them no chance of rallying, but pursued them right up to their encampment. The besieged, who had sallied forth from Alesia, well nigh despairing of success, sadly retreated into the town. Chapter 81. An interval of 1 day followed, during which the Gauls made a great quantity of fascines, ladders, and grappling hooks fixed to long poles. At midnight they moved silently out of camp, and advanced to the entrenchments in the plain. Suddenly they raised a shout to inform the besieged of their approach, and began to throw their fascines, to drive the Romans from the rampart with slings, arrows, and stones, and in every other way to press the attack. Simultaneously Vercingetorix, hearing the distant cry, sounded the trumpet and led his men out of the town. Our troops moved up to the entrenchments, in the places which had been severally allotted to them beforehand, and drove back the Gauls with slings throwing large stones, and sharp stakes which they had laid at intervals on the rampart, and with bullets. The darkness made it impossible to see clearly, and on both sides many were wounded, while missiles were hurled in showers by the artillery. 2 generals, Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius, who had been charged with the defence of this part of the lines, withdrew troops from the distant redoubts, and reinforced our men at every point where they saw them overmatched. Chapter 82. So long as the Gauls kept at a distance from the entrenchments, the number of their missiles gave them the advantage, but when they came closer, some trod unawares upon the spurs, others tumbled into the pits and impaled themselves, while others were transfixed by heavy pikes from the rampart and towers, and perished. Everywhere they suffered heavy loss, and at no point did they break the lines. Toward daybreak, fearing that they might be attacked from the higher camps on their exposed flank and surrounded, they fell back and rejoined their comrades. The besieged lost much time in bringing out the implements which Vercingetorix had prepared for the sortie, and in filling up the nearer trench, and finding, before they could approach the contravallation, that their comrades had withdrawn, they went back unsuccessful to the town. Chapter 83. Having been twice repulsed with heavy loss, the Gauls considered what was to be done. They called in natives who were familiar with the ground, and ascertained from them the position of the higher camps and the nature of their fortifications. There was a hill on the north which had such a wide sweep that the Romans had not been able to include it within the circumvallation, and were obliged to make the camp there on a gentle slope, which gave an assailant a slight advantage. This camp was garrisoned by 2 legions under the command of 2 generals, Gaius Ansticius Reginus and Caius Caninius Rebilus. After making a reconnaissance, the hostile leaders selected from the whole force 60,000 men belonging to the tribes which had the highest reputation for valour, secretly decided on their plan of operations, and fixed the attack for noon. Vercassivellaunus, an Arvernian, one of the 4 generals and a relation of Vercingetorix, was placed in command of the force. He left camp in the first watch. Towards daybreak he had almost finished his march, and concealing himself behind the hill, he ordered his soldiers to rest after the toil of the night. Towards noon he pushed on for the camp mentioned above, and simultaneously the cavalry began to move towards the entrenchments in the plain, while the rest of the host made a demonstration in front of their camp. Chapter 84. Descrying his countrymen from the citadel of Alesia, Vercingetorix moved out of the town, taking from the camp the long pikes, sappers' huts, grappling hooks, and other implements which he had prepared for the sortie. Fighting went on simultaneously at every point, and the besieged tried every expedient, concentrating their strength on the weakest points. The Roman forces, being strung out over lines of vast extent, found it hard to move to several points at once. The shouts of the combatants in their rear had a serious effect in unnerving the men, who saw that their own lives were staked upon the courage of others, for men are generally disquieted most by the unseen. Chapter 85. Caesar found a good position from which he observed all the phases of the action and reinforced those who were in difficulties. Both sides saw that now was the moment for a supreme effort. The Gauls utterly despaired of safety unless they could break the lines. The Romans, if they could but hold their ground, looked forward to the end of all their toils. The struggle was most severe at the entrenchments on the high ground, against which, as we have remarked, Vercassivellaunus had been sent. The unfavourable downward slope told heavily. Some of the assailants showered in missiles, while others locked their shields above their heads, and advanced to the assault, and when they were tired, fresh men took their places. The entire force shot earth against the fortifications, which at once enabled the Gauls to ascend and buried the obstacles which the Romans had hidden in the ground. And now weapons, and strength to use them, were failing our men. Chapter 86. On learning the state of affairs, Caesar sent Labienus with 6 cohorts to rescue the hard-pressed garrison, telling him, in case he could not hold on, to lead out the cohorts and charge, but only as a forlorn hope. Visiting the other divisions in person, he adjured them not to give in. On that day, he told them, on that hour was staked the prize of all past combats. The besieged, abandoning the hope of forcing the formidable works in the plain, took the implements which they had prepared, and attempted to storm a deep ascent. With a hail of missiles they drove off the men who defended the towers, filled up the trenches with earth and fascines, and with their grappling hooks tore down the rampart and breastworks. Chapter 87. Caesar first sent the younger Brutus with a number of cohorts, and afterwards Gaius Fabius with others. Finally, as the fighting grew fiercer, he led a fresh detachment in person to the rescue. Having restored the battle and beaten off the enemy, he hastened to the point to which he had dispatched Labienus, withdrawing 4 cohorts from the nearest redoubt, and ordering part of the cavalry to follow him and part to ride round the outer lines, and attack the enemy in the rear. Labienus, finding that neither rampart nor trench could check the enemy's onslaught, massed 11 cohorts, which he was fortunately able to withdraw from the nearest piquets, and sent messengers to let Caesar know what he intended. Caesar hastened to take part in the action. Chapter 88. The enemy knew that he was coming from the colour of his cloak, which he generally wore in action to mark his identity, and catching sight of the cohorts and troops of cavalry which he had ordered to follow him, descending the incline, which was plainly discernible from their commanding position, began the attack. Both sides raised a cheer, and the cheering was taken up along the rampart and the whole extent of the lines. Our men dropped their javelins and plied their swords. Suddenly the cavalry was seen on the enemy's rear, the fresh cohorts came up, the enemy turned tail, and the cavalry charged the fugitives. The carnage was great. Sedulius, commander and chieftain of the Lemovices, was slain. Vercassivellaunus the Arvernian was taken alive as he was trying to escape. 74 standards were brought to Caesar, and few of that mighty host got safely back to camp. Descrying from the town the slaughter and the rout of their countrymen, the besieged in despair recalled their troops from the entrenchments. Hearing this, the Gauls in camp forthwith fled, and if the soldiers had not been tired out by frequent supporting movements and by the whole day's toil, the enemy's entire host might have been annihilated. The cavalry were dispatched about midnight and hung upon the rear guard. A large number were captured and slain. The rest escaped and went off to their respective tribes. Chapter 89. Next day Vercingetorix called a council. He explained that he had undertaken the war not for private ends, but in the cause of national freedom, and since they must needs bow to fortune, he would submit to whichever alternative they preferred, either to appease the Romans by putting him to death, or to surrender him alive. Envoys were sent to refer the question to Caesar. He ordered the arms to be surrendered and the leaders brought out. The officers were conducted to the entrenchment in front of his camp, where he was seated. Vercingetorix surrendered, and the arms were grounded. Caesar allotted one prisoner by way of prize to every man in the army, making an exception in favour of the Aedui and Arverni, as he hoped by restoring them to win back the two tribes. Chapter 90. These arrangements completed, he started for the country of the Aedui, and received the submission of the tribe. Thither the Arverni sent envoys, promising to obey his orders, and he ordered them to furnish a large number of hostages. The legions were sent into winter quarters, and about 20,000 prisoners restored to the Aedui and Arverni. He directed Titus Labienus to march with 2 legions and a detachment of cavalry into the country of the Sequani, placing Marcus Sempronius Rutilius under his command, stationed Gaius Fabius and Lucius Minucius Bacillus with 2 legions in the country of the Remi, to protect them from injury at the hands of their neighbours the Bellovaci, dispatched Gaius Anstitius Reginus into the country of the Ambivaredi, Titus Sextius into that of the Bituriges, and Gaius Caninius Rebilius into that of the Rutini, each in command of a legion, and quartered Quintus Tullius Cicero and Publius Sulpicius in the country of the Aedui at Cabillo and Metisco on the Saone, to collect grain. He decided to winter himself at Bibracte. When the results of the campaign were made known by his dispatches, a thanksgiving service of 20 days was held at Rome. End of chapter 90. End of Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes.